Once upon a time, it looked like Black Chicago was raining money. But something suddenly happened that turned all that rain into a drought. Do you want to know what that was? Of course you do. Let's find out by continuing from the 1945 book Black Metropolis by sociologists St. Clair Drake and Horace Cayton. Excellence. Between 1924 and 1929, the prospects seemed bright. Those were the fat years, where Negroes had plenty of work, made a lot of money, and invested much of it into their Black metropolis. Then, in 1929, the Defender sounded an alarm. The Defender was Chicago's Black-owned newspaper founded in 1905 by Robert Abott. In 1929, it sounded this alarm.
Something is happening in Chicago, and it should no longer go unnoticed. During the past 3 weeks, hardly a day has ended that there has not been a report of another firm discharging its employees, many of whom have been faithful workers at these places for years.
A lot of people were suddenly getting let go from work. Do we know what was the underlying cause of this? If not, we will eventually find out. Negroes were advised to toe the line, work hard, and behave decently in order to impress their employers. By March, the paper was thoroughly aroused and in the mood to find a scapegoat. Its headlines reverted to an old object of attack with a plea for the federal government to arrest foreign workers without citizenship, referring to the newly arriving European immigrants. Apparently, they were hired in jobs that could have gone to Negroes first, who were actually U.S. citizens. The paper considered it unfair for foreigners to hold jobs while Negroes were jobless, and further charged the foreign-born with being apt students of segregation who would not work side by side with Negroes. They became puffed up and started seeing themselves as people above Negroes. In other words, they started to embody the authentic white consciousness, which was a deliberately designed mentality to keep those identified as Negroes in a low position. It was designed to create contrast and a gap between the two groups, which results in a superiority complex in whites and an inferiority complex in blacks. The Urban League, more sober in its appraisal of the situation, called a conference of leaders in Black Metropolis, after stating that
every week we receive information regarding the discharge of additional race workers who are being replaced by workers of other races.
For the first time in its history, the Defender began to advise Negroes to stay in the South. At first, this newspaper was enticing blacks to come to the North. It stressed how much they were mistreated and how much they were discriminated against in the South. But now the tables had turned, because white Chicago was also doing their fair share of discrimination. White papers talked of unending prosperity and were advertising a second World's Fair to celebrate a century of progress. But Negroes were a barometer sensitive to the approaching storm. They had reason to fear, while most of Midwest Metropolis seemed to suspect nothing, that the fat years were about to end. Uh-oh. Chicago's banking structure broke at its weakest link, in the Black Belt. What's the Black Belt? It's the section of South Chicago where blacks took over. The banking in this area was hit first during the crash. In July of 1930, Binga's Bank closed its doors, while mobs cried in the streets for their savings. Within a month, every bank in Black Metropolis was closed. Just like that. Booming one year, then closed the next. As white housewives balanced the budget, their Negro servants were often the first casualties. When factories cut production, unskilled Negro labor was usually the first to go. Negroes buying homes in the Black Belt and its suburbs suddenly saw their life dreams dissolving. The Depression had come to Midwest Metropolis, and Black Metropolis reflected the general disaster. The Great Depression came to town beginning in 1929 and lasting for a decade. This was a severe economic crash that had global impact, and it was something that nobody could do anything about because it was already in motion from years prior. Remember, I said before that world affairs are always in constant motion, along with everything else in life. But out of this motion arises events that clash with the lives of people in a society. And sometimes an event may line up in such a way that opens opportunities, like World War I did when Negroes went to the North, or like the Great Depression. It could align in such a way where it creates general disaster, like it did in the Black Metropolis. These types of events are largely out of the control of any community and any one person, which is why it's important to be ready to make adjustments and pivot, because change is most certainly coming your way. Whether you're prepared or not, it's coming. The lean years were at hand. When a person goes on a weight loss diet, the goal is to get rid of the excess weight stored in the body. Once they shed enough of that weight, they become lean. That's what happened to Negroes in Chicago. From 1924 to 1929, they waxed fat, pockets bulging, profits overweight. This was like an all-you-can-eat buffet. But when the Depression came, they were forced to go on a financial diet. Their pockets started shrinking, profits lost tons of weight, and the community looked like someone who had not eaten in 2 weeks. The lean years were at hand. The first reaction to the Depression was a deep sense of panic and frustration, followed by unorganized demonstrations of frantic mobs. The first organized reaction within Black Metropolis was a movement directed against white men who did business in the Black Belt. A group of ragged pickets walking in front of a Black Belt chain store in the fall of 1929 signalized the beginning of a movement which stirred Black Metropolis as nothing had done since the race riot. The attention of Negroes all over the country fastened on Chicago's "Spend Your Money Where You Can Work" campaign, which they really should have been doing before the Depression. Why would you want to spend your money with people who won't hire you because of skin color? They should not have had to experience a depression to understand this. But it is what it is. They eventually got their minds right and began to boycott. A Negro newspaper, The Whip, risking reprisal from white advertisers, politicians, and mortgage holders, became the aggressive spokesman for applying a boycott against all white business in the Black Belt that would not employ Negroes. The opening shot was fired against a chain grocery which responded to the boycott by hiring 3 colored girls. It had never had colored employees before. That's what pressure does. It influences action in a particular direction. The boycott created a social force that the store couldn't ignore. The owners knew if they didn't respond, they'd lose business. So they got with the program. The major attack was then leveled against the Woolworth stores, which for a time stubbornly resisted the pressure, but finally hired 21 girls, later raising the proportion of colored employees in all stores in Negro neighborhoods to 25%. You see that? Social pressure is just like hydraulic pressure in pipes. The pipes resist the force until enough force is applied to it. Then the pipes burst. That's what happened to the Woolworth stores. They resisted the social pressure from the blacks boycotting until it became too great and made the company cave in. Because enough pressure will make anything break, every time. Other minor victories convinced the Negro community that the boycott was a useful weapon, and many churches and community organizations united to pay pickets, to hire loudspeakers, to provide bail, and occasionally to supply a detail of members for the picket line. They found it to be a useful weapon, a tool of war, a weapon useful in influencing certain desired behavior, which was, in this instance, to force white-owned businesses to hire blacks. And when the churches, picketers, and the community organizers united, the effect of that weapon was amplified, and it gave the people real leverage. Yet some people in Black Metropolis branded the boycott campaign itself as communistic. Others feared that picketing would lead to race riots or to reprisals in the form of more rapid firing of those Negroes who had jobs outside of the Black Belt. But the proposition that stores doing business in colored areas should be forced to hire Negroes was a very popular one. The boycott campaign opened up a few hundred white-collar jobs. It did not solve the problem of the unemployed thousands. as Negroes watched white artisans coming into their neighborhood to work, or white laborers repairing streets and tracks in the Black Belt, their anger was aroused. Uh-oh, it's getting dramatic. On at least one occasion, this simmering antagonism exploded with dramatic violence. A mob of unemployed Negroes attacked a group of white laborers who were laying a streetcar track in the Black Belt, chasing them from the site. The Negroes then refused to leave the spot until the mayor, the colored congressman, and several traction officials had assured them that colored workers would get a share of the track-laying jobs. I guess that's what it had to come down to. Sporadic acts of individual violence against white men working in the Black Belt flared up throughout 1930 and 1931. So it wasn't just a one-way street even back then. Whites were violent with the blacks, and blacks, in other instances, inflicted violence on whites. Black Metropolis applauded such direct action. I guess they interpreted that as some form of evening things out. But even with all the violence blacks committed and applauded against whites, that still didn't change the fact that their community was continuing to lean out. One of the biggest issues that blacks had to deal with was not having enough money to pay their rent. A lot of them fell many months behind on rent and were eventually evicted to the streets. An example of this was given by the Chicago Whip newspaper, which said this:
declaring their determination to defend the jobless and hungry families which abound on the South Side from eviction by landlords because of their inability to pay rent, a group of young colored radicals restored 7 jobless families in the community after they had been evicted by the bailiff's office and their belongings set out in the street. The first of these cases occurred Wednesday, when more than 50 of the group, most of them young men who are themselves sleeping in the park, restored the belongings of Mrs. K.W., a poverty-stricken widow with 2 small children. The woman, who had been out of work since December, is 5 months behind in her rent and had no place to go when she was moved by the officers. A short while after her furniture had been set on the sidewalk, a young radical appeared and, breaking the new lock on the front door, returned her furniture piece by piece and ordered her to return to the house.
So it was rough out there. Throughout the 1920s, Black Metropolis had been hearing new voices talking to the Negro people, voices that spoke strange words: proletarian, bourgeoisie, class struggle, revolution. They heard the old-line Negro politicians castigated as misleaders and reformists. They saw white men and women standing on street corners with their Negro comrades, handing out newspapers and leaflets that denounced the fire traps and rent hogs in northern black belts, and painted a utopian picture of a Negro Soviet Republic which would arise someday in the South. They had a slogan: "Black and white unite." Now, what do we got going on here? This came out of nowhere. Blacks and whites unite? Talking like this in the 1930s? What happened next? Midwest Metropolis was frightened by this upheaval in the Black Belt. If it had been an out-and-out race riot, it would have been understandable. But here was something new: Negroes and whites together rioting against the forces of law and order. The renters' court immediately suspended all eviction proceedings for an indefinite period. This coming together of people from different backgrounds was what the earlier English colonizers sought to prevent. They operated under a class structure among themselves, but they had to find a way to neutralize the power of the larger population who didn't belong to that class. That's why they created the white identity and began giving privileges to those who identified as white and stripping them away from those identified as blacks. This way they could make the common laboring white person feel as though they were on the same team as the elite. And in order to protect that status, the white laboring class would do whatever was necessary to keep Negroes down in the pit. They acted as like the frontline soldiers for this cause, doing the dirty work for the elite. So those racial identities were created to cause ongoing conflicts between people, so the ruling class could operate with minimal disturbances. Now, if the English didn't implement this brilliant strategy, then they would have had to potentially deal with a whole bunch of people from the working class, no matter what skin color, uniting in a common cause to take them down, or at least agitate them to a great degree, which they didn't want. This is what happened during Bacon's Rebellion. And what we're seeing here is a glimpse of this happening with the segments of blacks and whites uniting to apply pressure. And that pressure worked. New increments of migrants from the South continued to come to Chicago all through the Depression. Between 1930 and 1940, the Negro population increased by more than 43,000. With the collapse of cotton tenancy in the South, and because of discrimination in the dispensing of relief and emergency employment, thousands of Negroes set out for Chicago. And this was really not a good time for Negroes to be flocking into Chicago in these large numbers. But I guess it also wasn't a great time to stay in the South either, which is why 44,000 Negroes ended up in Chicago. Occasionally, the Board of Education or one of the daily newspapers would complain that this in-migration was placing a strain upon the city's finances. Negro leaders were quick to remind them that America has no laws against interstate migration, and that with thousands of white Okies and Arkies on the road, it was unfair to single out Negroes for attack. Yet, as during the Great Migration, only the politicians really welcomed the migrants. In 1915, the Republicans, in the 30s, the Democrats. For by 1936, Black Metropolis was a New Deal town. It was Democratic, supportive of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and relying on government assistance for basic survival. The continuous squeezing of Negroes out of industry and the tide of in-migration combined to raise the proportion of Negroes on the relief rolls, until by 1939, 4 out of every 10 persons on relief were Negroes, and 5 out of every 10 Negro families were dependent upon some type of government aid for their subsistence. The Illinois State Commission on the Condition of the Urban Colored Population, reviewing the experiences of the fat years and the lean years, commented in 1940 that,
given a continuously expanding economy, it is reasonable to assume that Negroes in Chicago would have been able to raise the general level of their skills and to have reduced the disparity between their distribution in industry and that of white workers. But the Depression, with a devastating impact, reversed the trend of the 20s and turned the Negro people from a group with more than its share of the gainfully employed into a population predominantly dependent upon governmental relief.
Between 1935 and 1940, the Negro proletariat seemed doomed to become a lumpen proletariat, meaning an underclass, the class most subject to the exploitation of others, a class that includes a lot of criminals, prostitutes, and vagabonds. So at the end of this period, it looked like blacks in Chicago were heading in this direction. You see? So this was the fall after the rise. Blacks in Chicago went up, then went down primarily to uncontrollable forces. So we'll stop right here and we'll pick up with some more fire in the next commentary. So I thank you right now for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.